FYI. Okay. I was wondering if we should, and I'll share it. Uh,
Have you started the recording?
I did.
Okay.
I'm just gonna share. Just turning off notifications. So I was wondering if we might briefly talk about what I copied and pasted from last time, if that makes sense. Like if a review makes sense. What do you all think?
Sure, I'd be up for that.
So we were talking about different stages. I guess I'll jump back to this page around the design where there's this kind of explorational stage where things are beginning, where we don't really have a formal place for this today. I guess it's like the pre-RFC period. Maybe it's fine. But I think we do want something of one. But in particular, where you're coming up with use cases and examples and kind of exploring the range of possible solutions, and maybe starting to look. We were saying that using tests might be we don't do as much test writing now, but it would be nice if we had sort of it's essentially examples, right? But writing, helping people understand it by example, and then actually with examples that we can actually take to continue.
And I think also before, not just in the exploration phase, but also sort of before we go towards implementation, it would be nice to have.
I think even more later, because I think the goal of the explorational stage would be that you leave you don't necessarily have a thick syntax in mind or anything, like a notion of what the syntax looks like. So there's only so specific you can get.
Right.
And then this design and implementational stage is when I think now would be sort of when the team, you decide you want to commit to this, and the team sort of selects a general approach that seems like the best of the options, or a couple, and you try to drill in more detail. And I feel like this, right around somewhere in the midst of this phase is sort of where our existing RFC process kicks in. Like you've got enough to write a document and you kind of have a fairly specific proposal. And so the idea would be sort of to change the alignment a little. And then the evaluation stage would be like it's actually implemented and you're looking for people you would like feedback on it. And ideally at this point, you would want to have enough explainers and documentation to actually get feedback. And of course, stabilization is the final one. And so we were talking about like, when do we move? How do we move? What is it? How does the stage start and when do we move between stages? And the kind of entrance criteria. And it occurs to me what we didn't do is like go over what TC39 does and so on, which I think is possibly relevant. But, I kind of my background in my mind, but I don't know how much. But this is what we had here. So we were saying like, okay, if you're going into the exploration stage is kind of special because it's the first one, and we probably should talk about it because I think it's kind of important. But that leaving that aside for a moment, if you assume you have done exploration, then you can imagine that you kind of have this write-up exploring the known approaches and so on, and you want to kind of start to work on one of them. So the idea is that you would bring that write-up with some set of people, like who on the Lang team is sort of the sponsor or something, some people that will do the implementation. There needs to be enough people to do the implementation and to get it reviewed. And there's other bits of work, I don't quite know how we account for them. But the idea is you should have sort of enough people that you can make a convincing case that the work will get done. Because right now we often have this problem of they've accepted RFCs that don't really have implementers, or they just kind of linger and then they're in a weird state. Go on.
I think,
yeah. I watched back the last time's video, and something I found useful for myself is to not necessarily phrase it in like what is required to enter this stage, but to flip it around and be like, what are the deliverables from the current stage? So for exploration, it would have like, this is what you should have after the explore stage and what should be done. Sort of tied to that, something that I was missing was deliverables in terms of communication. Like we know that stabilization, or at least currently for async await, what follows from there is a stabilization report, right? Like just like docs follow probably from the evaluation stage, but like what kind of communication do we expect from these kinds of things was a bit of a question mark for me.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Towards whom?
I was thinking mostly external here, but communication general, I guess, is a bigger like thing.
I'm remembering that I spent a while thinking about this when I wrote this staged RFC proposal some time ago. And I broke it up like this on purpose because exactly around this now. There was this, TC39 does not describe it this way, and I thought it was confusing. That's a sort of what will you be doing in this stage? And then what do you do to exit this stage? What do you bring? And so on. I like the idea of, I think that's a good point that we should separate those things. And I think also that emphasizing the sorts of communication you would expect makes sense, both during and at the end, I think. So I guess you could say like during the exploration stage. As an aside, nobody liked my name spitballing, so I think we won't use that. But that was the other thing I was trying to do, is I had the ing name for like while you're doing it, and the noun form, non-gerund form. I guess they're both nouns. When for the thing that you present, but I guess ideally we would have some sort of like template for these things. But so during this exploration, you're supposed to be like generating ideas, but in terms of communication, I don't know.
I was thinking in terms of communication, like I don't know in what form, but maybe like a write-up like, hey, we found that this is a problem. Here are examples of this problem. Right. And then it's like, okay, cool.
Kind of regular updates.
Yeah, it forces everyone to understand what the problem is before the implementation is posted.
I think the point of the exploration is to find out also what the problem is, because you sort of, there's an iterative process between like having a solution, having a problem, having a solution, and you might find more problems as you work on the solutions, and different solutions cover different problems.
Right.
So,
yeah, I was more thinking of this as like, what do you deliver at the end of it? It's like hopefully that overview of the problems you see and want to solve.
Yeah, I feel like, so basically the exploration, we would expect some sort of description of the problems you see, solutions, and their pros, cons, if there are more than one. I don't know.
Right. I mean, we already do this, I think, just in a less standalone way.
I think what we don't, I think we do it in the best RFCs. We do it well, and in other RFCs we do it less well. I mean, it's sort of the alternative section of an RFC, for example, but we don't do it as a separated step. I think one difference that
I think the fundamental difference here is the staging bit, actually. So it's not so much that the content changes, but that we are separating the bits, like now you focus on the motivation and like the alternatives, and then you focus on like what do we want to do, and
one thing I think might be different beyond that is sort of the bias of the report. Like an RFC today is biased towards a primary solution and alternatives, and I think it might be helpful if we can make things more neutral for more of it, right? Of kind of possible directions. And there's probably bound to be some, well, I guess hopefully there arises like a certain preference, but I suspect it will not be uncommon that there's
I'm also not sure if it's helpful to be more neutral or less neutral, or if we are too biased at the moment. Like, the language, or to rephrase it, sort of. I feel like the language has a bias itself, for
Yeah.
certain patterns of solutions. Like, maybe if you take something from Haskell, it has more probable. It's more probable that it would fit with Rust, because we already have a bunch of stuff from like traits, and taking something from that might
Maybe.
make sense.
Maybe. I think it's helpful, but I think it can be done poorly. Like, I think I found if I try to write neutral text, sometimes it has no guts. It's just kind of colorless. It doesn't really say what the pros and cons are, because it's hard to present them in a neutral way. But I've been trying to like overcome that by just making a strong case in both directions. I need to, or something.
Right.
But
Yeah, I think that's something you should always do.
Maybe it might be useful to focus less on a proposal of solutions at this stage and more on the like 100% be like, this is the problem space we're looking to solve. And then as an addition to that is like, here's some possible things we're thinking of exploring or have explored or like whatever. And like in the stage after that, like in the design and implementation, you can strongly say like, hey, we chose this solution. Here's the alternatives. We've not chosen these alternatives for these reasons. I feel like I see you making a face, Nico. Is that
I'm
accurate?
making a thinking face.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
I want to give a piece of. I have a thought, but I continue. I think I agree.
So, I also agree partially, but I also think that if you focus too much on the problems without thinking about the solutions, you might end up sort of saying, well, okay, we focused on this narrow solution and we found a narrow, we focused on this narrow problem and found this narrow solution just for that, which maybe fits perfectly for that and better than something else, but covers fewer problems.
Quick addendum there. I'm not proposing we focus on a narrow problem space and a narrow solution. Like the hope is to get a map of the problem space in general.
Sure.
I think that should be the emphasis of the first part.
Yes, I'm just suggesting that. Yeah.
So the only thing I was going to say is that I think there's some iterative back and forth, but
yes,
maybe it's useful to like play out I don't know. I would like to try this on some examples in short, whatever we, like, I think it's a very abstract discussion we're having.
But I think we are generally, I think we've sort of been through this in different meetings. So I'm not sure that we are adding so much new information at the moment.
I agree. But one thing I was going to say is maybe the answer is that, Yash, that that there's some wiggle room, basically. Like, you have to be describing problems and you're maybe describing solutions, and like.
Sure, yeah, totally.
I don't know. I'm thinking of something like async IO or something where the problem space is actually really vast in some sense. I wonder.
I think async IO is not a good example to base courses on, because it's like a huge thing, and most of the issues we deal with are not as huge. I think they're.
I don't agree with that, but keep going.
I think they're more medium-sized in general.
I could spitball a quick one about like error handling. I know that sounds huge, but
that's a good one. Let's talk about error handling. It's a really good one.
Sounds good.
Okay, can I just talk for a little bit and then we like fill it out? Doesn't matter if it's 100% accurate or if there's like other things.
Go for it.
Just so we can go through a process. So in terms of problems, I'd say wrapping everything in OK, like the OK wrapping is not great, right? Sort of as things that I think
And some people disagree with that description.
Sure. Doesn't matter.
But
doesn't matter.
I think this should be the union of the problems, but it's probably worth noting. Yeah, some there will be some postpartum or post analysis of like what.
Yes.
Postpartum analysis would be interesting.
Yeah, it's just really not the same genre.
Yeah.
Then there's I'd say there's the thing where if you want to have like a generalized error type, it's like kind of painful, right? Like a box of din stood error plus send plus sync plus static, right? It's kind of painful to write out every single time. Yeah.
It's just verbose. Is that your point?
I think it's not only that, but also lacking in features.
Yep.
Like, yeah,
Maybe worth emphasizing. So verbose,
trait alias.
yeah, lacking in features, back traces,
Oh yeah.
causal information,
Yep.
etc. I don't know what etc. is. Probably worth it. That may be it. But.
Then like a third one, which may or may not be controversial, is that like annotating, like we have async annotation for like, hey, this function's like async. Given how common error is, maybe there's improvements we could do that would make it easier to spot like, hey, this is the actual type we're returning. Here's the error type. Right. Sort of as like the thing of like, hey, here's the improvements we could probably look at.
You haven't even gotten to the one that I see as the biggest problem.
Go ahead.
Which is closures and their interaction and iterators and wanting to throw from inside. I have absolutely no idea how to solve it, but I think it's a huge problem. TCP closures is often called.
Oh my God, yeah. I didn't even like realize, but that's so true.
If there were one thing, actually, this is probably the one thing I regret most in this. I think we should have worked on
Interesting.
TCP closures. Yes. It's in part because I don't have any idea how to fix it. Like other things, I can see a transition path. This one
sounds like an effect system. Anyways.
So I guess then, like, you know, there's a potential. Let's move to solutions, I guess. Then Central said effect system, I've heard.
Well, before we go to solutions, I want to talk about one thing. So Central brought up the not everybody agrees this is a problem. And I think that's an important thing. Yeah. I don't know how it fits in. I think it's important to list the problems, and I think it's also important to talk about like why they may or may why people think they're a problem and why they don't. I don't know if that would be just like subheadings of these bullets or something, but like certainly in this space in particular, there's a lot of disagreement, or there's, you know, like I think Josh and probably Central, I'm guessing, you know, they feel like, oh, it's very good to have the clarity of the return type and the functioning of the type system exposed is good for learning and so on. There's a concern that some of the solutions may be worse than the problem, kind of, and I don't quite know how that gets reflected in this description. But
I think any good RFC would have like a back and forth, and like you lay out a case and motivation for why this is a problem worth solving, and then you disagree with yourself and like have a list of pros and cons. Why some may think this is a problem, like why some may think it's not a problem, etc.
One thing I've tried, I sort of like this idea, and I found it somewhat successful, is taking what I call the narratives, right? You kind of lay out the sort of problems and maybe the solutions. Maybe we should talk about those in a second. And then try to say, like, here's one camp. They kind of feel like these are the biggest problems, and these are less big, and therefore that leads them to this. And I find it helpful to me to try to write out like, what are the narratives and why is the story to give weight, to make it less dry.
I don't know that one should describe things in terms of camps of people, rather like ascribing viewpoints to people. I think it might be better to just have the viewpoints and then discuss the pros and cons of those, and incorporate the nuances.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, it does seem risky to group people, like camps puts people in a mindset maybe, but I also think it's like useful to describe what's real, that there's like collected different ways to look at the problem. And anyway, let's talk about the solutions stuff. So Wayashi, you were saying something. about effect systems.
Yeah, like I've heard effect system float around. Like, how do we solve this? Like effects. Some other people are like along the lines of monads. I didn't understand, but let's say effects for now, right?
Yes.
Right.
There's like I think Boats' proposal had like a throw, like the throw keyword in like inside the body, and like throw as like an argument, right?
Yeah. So there's various like there was sort of try blocks are part of this story. There's like various pieces of a story which
Yeah, I was gonna say try fun as the next one.
And
then there's like the possibility of some sort of sugar being tossed around.
Reminds me of Ruby a little bit.
Yay.
And there's also one lightweight idea I had, which isn't specific to error handling and effects. It's just syntactic sugar, which would allow you to write something like FN through which is just it's just like a more lightweight way to denote the body of a function, basically.
Not to mention, I've been debating about writing this procedural macro. There's a kind of map between these, right? Like these last two, I don't know if this is something Central and I have discussed before, but the idea would be to have that you can write equals and an expression,
right.
And that this is just an expression.
I actually have more or less a complete RFC about this.
Yeah. But these two sort of they're like, well, this one, the procedural macro especially is sort of a, if you have this, you can build other things. Like there's an ordering between them. In other words, there are dependencies.
Can I make a small procedural note where we're engaging like pretty hard on the exact details of all these? Whereas I think the more important part is to like go through the process fast.
Yeah, we shouldn't get into details. But
one
point is that it's not just a flat space. Like I think you want to show the solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
and
notably here the solutions also solve different problems. So the procedural macro is something that you could do in a library. Presumably, it would just be a crate, and the shorthand for trying like equals try would be nice sugar, perhaps nice sugar for match and one-liner functions, and it's not specific to error handling, but it helps error handling.
I guess something that we're missing in this list of solutions is we're just looking at the try parts, but for example, adding backtraces is related to this complete thing, but it's like a different like family.
Right.
Like this would be its own RFC, I guess. Similar for like causal information, likely.
I think, I was just thinking that, first of all, that we haven't addressed all the problems, and secondly, that it feels like there's very fine-grained solutions, but you sort of also want to be having a story. I don't know. Maybe it's just the way you present the solutions, but like having a common set of things you're trying to show and saying this is how it would look and work in these different ways.
So I'm kind of feeling like after problem definition, you don't necessarily come up with like one RFC. You can come up with a family of RFCs, like multiple separate ones that are unrelated but work towards the same solution, or like a chain where you're like, hey, we sort of see a future path here.
My assumption was that the group, that there's like, the working group has, you sort of lay out, one of the first things you'd be doing is laying out a roadmap. Here are the problems, here are the stages we expect to solve these problems in, and each of those may be more of an RFC. But and
that actually sounds, sorry.
The chain could be affected by each individual RFC, whether it's adopted or not.
It doesn't necessarily have to be a chain, it could also be a tree.
Or a tree, yep.
Yeah.
Right, but they should somehow all, there is a coherence you should be able to tell a coherent story of like, here's where we're going to end up, and here are the pieces along the way. I think a good example of this is Infiltrate, where I think we have not done an amazing job, but we have a lot of moving parts around Infiltrate, where there's a lot of places you can use it, and they're each sort of their own RFC, and that's good. What we don't have is like a clear place where you can go and see, here's the final language you're going to have. One of the best places is actually the current pending RFC, which actually does sort of do that in its documentation. I was reading it the other day. I was like, oh, this is very close to what I wanted to see. And I was imagining that, just to sketch out what that could look like, that you could imagine having a program that's like a website that's showing all the Infiltrates places you can put it with like links for each one, kind of telling you like, in this position, this is what it means. Here's the RFC. Here's the current status. Just some way to convey that in terms of speaking.
Are we Infiltrate yet?
Right. It's sort of, this is what Are We Infiltrate yet might look like.
Seems very specific.
Yes, it's an example. I think the Are We X yet for each of these things will look different. But
by the way, I feel that the roadmap, the thing we just laid out, that's an excellent external communication device at the end of the exploration stage.
Yes, I strongly agree.
Yeah.
Agreed.
I feel like it's more the beginning of the design and the end of exploration. Like it should. The only reason I'm separating that is I think there's some room for like doing exploration where we don't expect to start writing the code right away. My canonical example for this is I want us to think about what it means to integrate with WASM GC, but I don't want to spend time writing WASM GC code because there is no WASM GC proposal. But I want to have a story for when there is one that we can give useful feedback. And I don't know that we need a roadmap yet, but like it would be nice to, I could imagine kicking it off and saying, we're just doing the first phase right now.
I think that's fair.
Maybe, anyway. But if you can get it somewhere around the end of the exploration, the beginning of design is a good time.
So I think the Infiltrate is an example of the same feature, but the implementation staging of that feature. I don't consider Infiltrate and various positions to be different features. You could see them that way, but I don't. Whereas something like the ergonomics initiative would be more like a collection of features working towards like the problem that the language is sufficiently ergonomic at the moment. That's a very broad description of problems, however.
Have you all seen the skill tree, WASM? I agree with you. Sorry, I just want to jump one thing out. I'm just talking about it all the time. But
Yes, it's so good.
for those of you who
I
have
haven't
been talking
seen
to me recently, it's like all I ever talk about.
Oh, that's right.
This is like the best thing that ever existed. And in
That's
terms of showing a roadmap, right? It's bigger than a lot of what we do, but not all of it. Like you could imagine, it's about some of these boxes might be things like, I don't know, for something like async IO or something, I think the scale is not inappropriate, basically. But trying to tackle, here are some use cases, here are the pieces that come into it.
That's nice. However, I think it biases heavily towards domain-specific thinking, and that is a problem for a general-purpose language like Rust. So we have to keep that in mind.
Sorry, I'm not sure I follow. Could you say more?
So if you think in terms of skills and sort of what domain-specific problems we want to solve, then I think that biases towards domain-specific solutions, whereas Rust is supposed to be a general-purpose language, and I think you have to keep in mind that you have to keep that in mind.
I think that you're right that there's a danger there that if you overly narrowly focus, but I think what the antidote is A, keeping in mind general purpose, but also B, that the skill tree is a number of different domains. Like that's the point of it, essentially.
Right.
Showing that here are many different domains of things you might do with WASM, and here's what they how they relate to one another, and here are features that benefit more than one.
Yes.
And that sort of biases you towards trying to push things up the tree to the right spot. Right? So I think the goal there is probably to have skill trees around an area, but that they should integrate into a larger skill tree that is like the language, and
Right.
So coming back to what you were saying about features central, I think that was an important point about like ergonomics. I was just thinking that maybe that's not one working group. Also, I don't know, but I think that I don't know how big that's a good question, how big a thing should be. I don't know.
That one, the ergonomics initiative was huge, and we haven't finished it yet.
Right. So
We're not making new proposals, but we are still backlogged on those.
I feel like that's somehow like a team effort as much as anything. We spin off things around a specific area. So do we?
Just a quick time check. We have 20 minutes left.
Yeah, I was wondering what's the next step in this like error handling example.
So you have narratives written down. Skill tree was part of that?
Yeah, narratives was. I don't think it's. I don't know what I wrote it down, but I think somewhere. Well, it's more about how you present. It's more about how you justify what path you've chosen. This is where it comes down. Like why you think this is a good collection of features and trade-offs. And
interesting. If you think about the sort of chain and trees of solutions here, is that if you just have the shorthand function syntax where you say equals try, but you don't have try, then you can't write equals try. You can just write like equals match. But if you have try, then those two interact. And if you sort of would have postfix match, then you would sort of get try match for free, more or less.
So that's a good example of where I imagine this sort of iterative nature of problem solving. Like we come in with error handling, we come up with this idea, and then there are problems that are not related to error handling that are potentially addressed by this idea. And I feel like it's legit to include sort of in some way to talk about them. One thing I noticed we're missing from this, something I've heard about TC39 in both good and bad ways, is that the staging process is sort of biased towards action. Because especially as you move towards the later stages, it becomes harder to object because it's like, well, the time for that was later, which is a good thing, but also maybe a bad thing. And that one thing that we're not talking about here is like positives, not just problems, but like strengths we want to preserve or dangers or something. I think that's kind of related to this concern about okay wrapping. Yeah, but
yeah. I like the idea of having a section for what do we want to preserve as we solve this problem or something to that effect. I think that's important.
I mean, for error handling, what might it be? I think one might be that there is a transparency towards the current system, right? Of like, in other words, you see that how it works. I mean, you kind of can't help but see how it works because you have nothing else to. That's all there is. But you see that errors are an error is a type, like, and that you can jump into it. I don't know if it's something we necessarily want to preserve, but I think it's a strength.
Josh has made points about type-based reasoning, although I don't agree that some solutions diminish that, but Josh thinks so.
I think that's kind of what I'm trying to get at. I think, yeah, it feels like it would be important to me to lay out that argument in a good way, like separately from just why okay wrapping might not be such a big problem. Like it's more an argument of this is a strength, this is something Josh values that some of these solutions might injure.
Yes. I think in terms of going back to the original point about the train and having a hard time to stop it, once you've reached a certain point. One thing which might help is that you are clear about sort of what things are experimental and what things are more like we are sure about this.
Yeah, that's a good. I don't know where to write that down, but I wanted to add something else which I think may be related, which is unknowns.
Yes.
I think, especially around the early phases, there will be a lot of unknowns, and some of them will be like, we think this is a good solution because X, Y, Z, because we hypothesize the following, like that this will be very common, or that this, and you would want to be able to talk about that. But also, like, one other thing that I remember people bringing up is that just it's very useful early in the design process. Someone might raise an objection like, well, this could be unsound if you like fail to take into account whatever variance or something.
Or it could make X language feature impossible, or
Right.
Y performance improvement impossible, or introduce performance regressions, although performance regressions are more testable.
I think like, yeah, basically being able to write those down and then move on is very important, but also that they will actually get revisited.
Right. Whenever I don't know if it's the final solution, but whenever the next stage is communicated, the unknowns and constraints should absolutely be a part of it.
Right. And that's
and
part
how
of
they
the
were
like,
addressed.
that's part of avoiding the steamroll, I think.
Yeah.
The concern is there. If it doesn't get addressed, you're legit to just walk until it does.
So something that's very interesting from the TC39 stage proposal, or a staged thing, is that there's one phase where it requires, if possible, sometimes it isn't, but generally it is, to have a Babel transform, where Babel is more or less the the JavaScript compiler. Yeah, I should air quote that because, reasons, but it's like, hey, if like we can implement this in terms of Babel, so like
What's the relevance to Rust?
What the relevance is? Well,
To Rust.
That aligns with Nightly, but carry on now.
I think there's a stage before that. Yeah, like sort of, right? Because I feel like sometimes like Nightly is more blessed than we would like it to be, where if something's in Nightly, getting it out of Nightly is like, oh, people's builds break, or something to that akin. But if we can implement something in using proc macros, for example, what we saw with async await, it's extremely valuable.
Yeah, that's actually 2 points. That's a really good point. So proc macros, and the other thing would be, maybe it's more of a general thing, but looking at, in general, factoring out, I think, around the solution space, like we might bias towards solutions that enable experimentation via proc macros to feed into later solutions. Which I think we don't currently.
And some problems of proc macros are like already known, but as sort of if you have some sort of syntactic sugar, then it might make sense to just try it out with a proc macro, because proc macros are sort of sugary things, but their macros are also syntax only things, so they have well-known limits.
So do we have
go on. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to try to like see if we're close enough to wrapping up with some kind of exploration template. But
so one thing in terms of knowing early on whether something is like implementable or feasible in terms of complexity for the compiler, is if we have a formal grammar, then we can just write the productions into the grammar and see, okay, is this ambiguous? What's the consequences for the grammar if we add this?
Are we anywhere near close to having a formal grammar?
We're working on it.
That's not an answer. Like, will it land this year? Will it land next year? Is it longer than that?
It's hard to say. We're sort of working on the parser generator at the moment.
Right. So the reason why I'm asking this is if this is something to consider for an exploration template that we're going to make now, it should be something that's in the near term, which it doesn't sound.
So what we would do now, I think, is just to encode the grammar rules in the style of the formal grammar that we would use, but we wouldn't actually check them. We would just reason informally, like unchecked about them.
I'm a little bit confused where the grammar comes in. I feel like it's too early to talk about specific. Like it may be that we have a specific grammar in mind, but that's not a necessary requirement at this stage.
I agree.
Well, so in terms of exploration, then a proc macro is probably too soon as well. That feels more like checking whether the implementation makes sense. A proc macro is probably not a good idea to try out whether the solution makes sense, because it will feel radically different if it's implemented in the language, whereas it will be implemented in a proc macro.
I have two anecdotes there to the contrary, where something that we've been thinking about with the command line working group, which since yesterday I'm no longer a part of, 2 days ago, is like
you're free.
Yeah, but so something we were thinking of adding is like, hey, what if we could like add arguments to main, right? So you can give it like implement the traits, and then you can pass arguments to main. It's kind of nice for command line programs, right? And it was very well to implement like using proc macro. And we were like, hey, cool, let's build this, try it out, gather feedback. Like, let's give it 6 months or something, right?
Sure, but that is a rather domain-specific thing that would be unlikely to be added to the language itself, I feel.
Maybe I'm unsure. Wait, hold on. Maybe I'm unsure like where the language ends and starts, but like what you can and can't pass to the main function is a bit unclear to me. Is that lips? Am I confused here?
I would call it lang, but regardless. So you were saying you might use it a procedural macro to prototype it. I wouldn't care to pass judgment on what might or might not get added to the language. I don't particularly agree with Central that that's not something we could add, but obviously it would be contentious.
Like
but I want to hear more of the story part.
So yeah, like people seem to like it so far, but the second one we're doing is like using doc comments to add context attributes to all error types. So if we go back to like the error stuff with the, what was it? Not the backtraces, but the other one, the annotations, right? To like use doc comments for that purpose, like, hey, is this great? We don't know. Let's try it out, right? So we're currently also monitoring that.
So there's kind of an experiment.
Yeah.
I feel like part of, I'm really, so I don't know if you've all been seeing what I've been trying to.
So that feels more like figuring out whether a mapping solution would be sufficient. That it feels like that's the question you're trying to answer.
No.
Whereas what I understood was more like we want to figure out whether like what are the constraints of the language solution.
So it's very much not like would a macro solution suffice, but like what would a possible language feature feel like, right? The closest we can get to without like starting messing around with the compiler. Just like with the async await syntax, it was first introduced as a proc macro, which isn't ideal, but you get a feel for how this would be, which helps inform or helps strengthen like the direction you're taking. It just helps inform the conversation, right? Because people actually get to try it out. Not saying that this is the only way to do it, not saying that this is applicable to every language proposal, but I think it has its place, and if possible, it ought to be encouraged.
Probably very sugary things.
I think it goes a lot deeper. I mean,
connected to the type system and operational semantics.
I don't know. Like, I think there's a lot of. I think we should be. I feel like it's a little off, but I think in general it will be good for us to be trying to leverage the power of procedural macros and so on to do exploration outside of the lane before we have to choose a solution. And I think we may be surprised how far we can get, but yeah.
I would tend to prefer to experiment nightly instead with the language feature. Like,
Here's another part. Experimenting inside the compiler is kind of exclusive. It requires people to A, have knowledge of the compiler, then B, have a good enough machine to actually get these features in, or they need to rely on other people. Whereas
it's
this
also a burden on the compiler team.
Exactly. Like this just lowers the bar and makes it a lot easier to like try things out, which is why I think we should encourage it.
but
It depends on the problem, I think. But
yes.
like you can't. Well, you could see even something like generic associated types. Like it's plausible you could write procedural macros. There are desugarings that are just very complex, but there are limits to how far you can go along these lines. Regardless, I wanted to use the last 4 minutes to look at this and see if we actually got on something or not. My feeling is, so I separated out problems in and around the space, positives and strengths to consider, solutions and how they relate to one another, unknowns and constraints, things to be resolved later. And I also have this roadmap recommendation narrative. I have a lot of question marks here because I think this part is by far the least clear. And I suspect that's okay. Like, I think it can vary a lot between proposals, but I definitely think the idea of saying, you might come in with, I have a lot of answers, or we have a lot of questions. We have more questions than answers. Here's like a space of solutions. We ourselves don't know which one is best. We want to run these experiments and so on. That's probably something that should still be considered exploration, though. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how much of an answer you need here before you move out of this stage. I don't know. It also can be something that we just try it a few times and shape the answer based on how it seems to be working. The reason, like if we agree this is sort of vaguely good, there is, I would think that some homework we could do would be trying to actually go ahead and write this write-up for a few things. We sort of did error handling a little bit here, but I would be interested in trying it out on some other problems. I'm also interested in giving it to Josh to do for C parity, or FFI, which I know he already sort of has a roadmap up there.
I'm very scared.
One, but I think Josh would be excited about it too. He's not here today, but I've talked to him about this already.
Nice.
Cool.
I don't think I'll have time to like do a full thing in the next week, but
yeah, I didn't mean homework for like next week per se. Although that's not a bad idea. I don't know if I'll have time.
Actually, something that might be useful as homework for everyone, if they haven't done it yet, is like look at the TC39 staging thing, because I haven't like properly looked at it. I just like know a few things.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's talk about homework. It's probably. Yay! I think that's a good idea. All right, so I think Nico is going to try and apply this exploration template to, I don't know what, infiltrate or something. The research TC39, not a bad idea. If people don't know it, I think it's a good idea. It's actually somewhat documented.
I am sort of wondering why we are thinking so much about TC39. I hear about it a lot.
Partly it's because I know a lot of people in it, but it's also because they do a good job in some respects.
It feels very different from, like, we just have one compiler and we don't have like Firefox has to implement it and other browsers need to implement it, and
we learn things from them.
I would be happy if you want to point at other things that we should research as well. By the way, it happens to be it's a good example and a well-documented one, but I don't think it's the only one by any means. So, like in particular, they have this website, for example. This is like something I obviously strongly wish we had. Communicating, there's a bunch of proposals. Here's the author's champions, test status, expected dates, different stages.
Oh, wow.
And you can click on one like, oh, I'd like to learn about decorators. And then you go to its associated repo.
That's cool.
Explainer, like this is totally what we want to be having, right? I don't know. You don't think so? In what way?
I don't think we should split the repo. I think that
Totally
makes
not
things
the higher order bit.
right.
I don't agree anyway. I think you should, but that's not the higher order bit. We can discuss it. I don't care that much. I just want a list with links.
Doesn't GitHub have that already? Like the list of pull requests and some list of links?
No. I mean, you don't see the difference between this. Hold on.
It has some more meta information about like who is responsible and such, but
You don't see a difference between this. It's not just about meta information. Like,
not substantially. These are well labeled. I've spent a whole lot of time labeling these.
yeah, but they reflect nothing. There's no consensus. There's no notion of how far along it is along the stage. It's just this is text.
I mean, there's no fundamental reason why you couldn't integrate that into like the list itself. You could add more labels. You could
That's
assign.
fine. That's just
people-
an instance of the TC39 process.
Right.
In my view, just instantiated with labels and not.
My next meeting is starting, so I'll be dropping
Yeah.
out.
I got to run too.
I've got to drop too. Good to see you all.
All
So,
right.
yeah.
Good. See ya.
See you
Cool.
later.
By the way, how is
Hold on, wait. Stop the recording.